Hello, BookTube. Earlier today, I watched a video on Daniel's channel, Guilty Feet. I'll leave a link to it down below, in which he discusses reading projects. A fascinating subject that has come up on this channel many, many times. I don't think I've ever devoted a specific video to it. I think it's so interesting. He's not talking here about BookTube events that work towards organizing one portion of your reading in some way or another. And he's not talking about a TBR for any week or any month or even any year. Instead, he's talking about something else, something I think a lot of readers do. Certainly I do it, which is, alongside all the other stuff you're doing, is there a reading project that has a shape of its own that you are pursuing just for yourself? When I was watching his video, I was thinking of all the reading projects that I've done over the ages, and including over the years that I've had this channel, and I realized something that's going to take a little bit more thought on my part. I realized that although I will mention some of the reading projects that I do on this channel, I never talk about them, not in detail. They feel oddly private to me, not to everybody. A lot of people make them the subject of videos on the channel all the time. But what I'm talking about here, what Daniel's talking about in his video, is where you yourself set a kind of invisible curriculum for some aspect of your reading. In his video, he mentions reading all of James Baldwin in publication order and reading Percival Everett. Two reading projects, but obviously different, because one is bookended and one is not. Percival Everett is still a prolific writer. James Baldwin is no longer composing; he is rather decomposing. You have a completely bracketed body of work for him, which opens up two kinds of projects that you could do, two kinds of reading projects that you could do. One is far more informal than the other. The informal one is, Daniel mentions a kind of reading project in his video called an ad hoc reading project, where eventually you realize that you are in fact pursuing a project. It's not really top down, it's not really organized on paper. Leaving that aside, you are conducting a kind of reading project when you have a stable of what Daniel refers to as must-read authors. They are currently writing, and you are reading everything they do. You could say that that is just that you have preferences, that you have taste, likes and dislikes, but that's also a kind of project. You can't help but make it one, because when you're reading the latest book by someone whose every book you have read, you can't help but put it in a spectrum. You can't help but read comparatively, which I think is a big part of a reading project, where you are starting to take on a body of work, where you are taking on a body of work and trying to understand not only each book, but what the whole body of work is. I think the subject is absolutely fascinating. That kind of reading project is open-ended, because the author is still alive. So they're still writing books, and there can be disappointments, and there can be radical changes of pace or tone. There can be drastic missteps. Whereas when an author has died, you have a discrete body of work that you can that you can look at from start to finish. I hesitated there because the 21st century has seen a flourishing of what I call necrofiction, where an author who is well and truly dead will have their name on a book, and they'll just keep publishing. And the design, I think, of the publishers when they create a whole body of necrofiction is to fool the public. I think their ultimate design, you might think that their ultimate motivation is this, just to serve the reading public. Our readers, we know that our readers love X books by Y author, so we're just going to keep producing them, even though Y author is dead and isn't producing them himself anymore. You might think that, and that might on some level be true, but I'm looking at something like Brian Herbert's Dune books, where the goal is clearly, there is at least one other goal, and that is to confuse the reader into thinking that it is all one big body of work, that the body of work is continuing, when it is certainly not. An author's body of work stops when their heart stops. That's all there is to it. There might be a manuscript in a bottom drawer of a desk. There might be. I believed that about Michael Crichton precisely once. I believe it about John le Carré precisely once. I don't believe it any after that. There is no possibility of that after that. And even that once is really the equivalent of Dr. Watson's battered tin dispatch box. It really isn't believable. If you make your living writing novels, best-selling novels, there isn't going to be a complete novel knocking around in your study. I mean, imagine, to say that that is likely is to say that the best baseball player in the world sometimes just privately flies out to a private diamond in Arizona and plays 5 games with a whole crowd and a whole audience, and no one films him. He doesn't make any money. He's not expected to be paid for them. He hits all sorts of homers, breaks all sorts of personal records, but nobody ever sees it. No, it's just something I wanted to do on the side. No, you don't believe that. You don't believe that Da Vinci has a secret painting, and I don't believe it for authors either. But we'll let it go. We'll leave necrofiction aside and just talk about bodies of work. If an author is dead, then you have a body of work that you can go through. And that is often a tempting target for reading projects. I do that all the time myself. Daniel's video got me thinking about what motivates the reading projects that I do. And typically, it's not so much that one of the motivations that came up in Daniel's video, which is that I want to read everything by this author. Typically, that is not a motivation of mine with an author who is dead. Because typically, I have already read everything that they've done. I am, as we say in South Boston, wicked pissa old. So there are a great many authors who were the first kind of reading project for me, where I was reading everything that they wrote as it was coming out. There are a huge number of authors like that. It's usually not that. For me, the motivation is usually that I read an author's body of work and didn't like it, and that ordinarily would not be a problem. I am a critic. I am in the business of not liking things, but didn't like it, but I keep hearing the pitter-patter of little feet of readers I respect. They might not be publishing working book critics, but they're readers I respect who like that body of work a lot more than I did. Sometimes even love it. I know that I come across on this channel as a steely-eyed, 8-pack ab, raven-haired, sexy social influencer who never doubts anything, ever. But that's not true. If I watch somebody's BookTube channel, for instance, and it happened before BookTube, with readers that I knew, other critics that I knew, if I watch somebody's BookTube channel and they significantly more appreciate an author that I didn't appreciate at all when they were writing, sooner or later that's going to have an effect on me. Also, it comes up in books. If I read memoirs or biographies or something like that, some treatment where an author I have written off keeps coming up in respectful and insightful tones, that will drive me back to that author. That's typically why I do it, because there's a discord between what I think of an author's body of work and what the cool kids think of an author's body of work, and I want to be one of the cool kids. So I will, if that discord bothers me, that will often motivate a reading project on my own, which I refer to as a systematic reread, where I pick an author and really possess them, really go in depth into their life and work. Usually I will start with letter collections and biographies, and then I will move into the works. That won't be true for everybody. For a lot of people, that would be a very dry and sort of ending revealing, sort of spoily way to go at it, would be to do that. A lot of people would consider that the very worst way to get into an author, with an eye towards renovating your opinion of them. But I love it. I absolutely love it. It has never led me wrong. I start with letters, I start with diaries, I start with biographies. I read a lot of those, and then I move into the works. And when I move into the works in a systematic reread of an author, I do them in publication order, and as close as I can get to composition order, because that matters. I want to see that. I want to see that happen. And glean everything that I can from it. The goal of a systematic reread is not just to change my attitude, or at least to give my attitude all the food it needs to change on its own. It's also to possess an author, to really feel like I possess an author. The authors that I love, or even the authors that I like, I also possess. But the ones that I've sort of written off, I've said, it's you again, your same old tricks. You did this in 81, you did this in 82, you did this again in 85, you do this in every interview. And it's not a good thing that you're doing it. You're doing it poorly. I can name 10 people that do it better than you. This very thing you're trying to do, the only thing you try to do. When it comes to authors like that, I usually don't load myself down with letter collections and biographies and whatnot, unless I want to do a systematic reread. That's one way that I will do something like this, is to do a systematic reread of an author where I think there's a gap here between what all of these readers I respect think and what I think. And maybe the gap is my fault. On this channel, I have not taken you through it, but I have mentioned a few of those systematic rereads over the time that we've been on this channel together. I did one for Ernest Hemingway, I think, right around the same time that I was starting this channel. I did one for Ernest Hemingway. It didn't yield me a whole lot of yardage. I didn't come away with a much different opinion of Hemingway's writing than I did when I started. And I came away with a lot worse opinion of Hemingway himself. Worshipful biographies of Hemingway, and let's face it, they're all worshipful, always play down the violence. For instance, sure, lots of wives, lots of girlfriends, but when's the last time you read a Hemingway biography that mentioned striking them in the face with a closed fist? I can think of 10 Hemingway biographies that don't mention that. They simply don't mention that, even though that, as a fact, happened. How many of them go into rampant bigotry of the man? Just rampant, ugly, unrepentant, court-holding bigotry of the man. Virtually never. You can scarcely read a Hemingway biography that's not a Hemingway hagiography. And when I did a deep dive into him, I had to get past that. And what I found when I got past it was the reason why that's true. It was not present at all. And that sometimes happens. Sometimes I'll do a systematic reread and it barely moves the needle at all. That's just the way of it. Whereas other times, it's miraculous. Just wonderful. One of the systematic rereads that, like, for instance, well, one author I could obviously mention here is Charles Dickens, which is obviously going to be a lifelong thing, and I suspect a lifelong failure. I think I'm just going to be systematically rereading Dickens for the rest of my life. I've been reading him my whole life, trying to find out why so many people love him, and it has not worked. The fiction is a black box to me. It has had a hugely positive effect. I love reading about Dickens. I think he would have been a lot of fun to know, but he is endlessly fascinating to read about. I have read tons of letter collections, tons of biographies, tons of splinter biographies. Here is Dickens in Boston. Here is Dickens as an editor. Here is Dickens as a freelancer. Loved it all. Just loved it all. I gobble up books like that. But they have not been the skeleton key that opens the fiction to me. They just have not been. Same thing with Proust. Just no, just a flat black box. But sometimes it's been miraculous. The one that has come up the most on this channel has been the poet Auden, who forever and ever struck me as, okay, it's first of all, it's not very good poetry, and second, it's kind of simple. It's kind of boring poetry. It's meant to speak your mind at the present moment, which is not what we pay our poets to do. All we do now. That's the only thing they do now. But once upon a time, they were supposed to speak our thoughts in perfect words. And I didn't think that Auden was a poet who did that. So I read, the collected poems, the big paperback that came out. I read that front to back, and I think I read one biography, and I read his collected nonfiction, his afterwards and forwards and whatnot, that are wonderful. The Dyer's Hand, this stuff like that is wonderful. His writing, the deadline stuff that he did on my side of the fence for editors about books, I thought was fantastic. But for a long time, his poetry just did not open to me at all. Despite the fact that I knew a lot of people who were writing books about him and who were extolling him and for whom he was a poet who spoke all our thoughts in perfect words. He was that. They knew lines. The lines came unbidden to their mind for exactly certain situations in their own daily life. Wow. When that's being jotted down in a personal journal that was never meant for publication, it cannot be a pose. It cannot be a lie, and it can't be for Auden's benefit. It can't be meant to get around to him. It has to be true. You see enough of that. You hear enough readers that love this guy. I embarked on a systematic reread of Auden. I reread a lot of those books, a lot of those biographies. I read a lot of new ones, a lot of literary treatments, and I reread the poems slowly, meditatively, absorbing them, and it worked. In Auden's case, it worked. Absolutely. It almost entirely worked with T.S. Eliot as well. Almost. Poetry, most of the poetry still doesn't do a lot for me. But it does a lot more than it did before I did my reading project. I call it a systematic reread, but my reading project on T.S. Eliot. And of course, I'm doing one this year. At least one this year. I'm kind of tempted in a way by young Joe Spivey, new BookTube phenom who's going to hit 3,000, 4,000 subscribers in the time it takes most people to get to 200. He has mentioned on his channel that he's a wide omnivorous reader now. I think the focus on his channel now is largely canonical classics. But he's mentioned a few times on his channel that his reading origin story, we all have one, that his reading origin story largely involves Martin Amis, the novels of Martin Amis. He says that he doesn't venerate them anymore, but that he, as he often puts it, I wouldn't be here now talking about books if it weren't for him. Okay, fine. A lot of us are not proud of our reading origin. I am lucky that my reading origin is the classics, or I would have the same shameful thing to talk about. I guess maybe I could, because maybe part of my reading origin is Sue Roy and Adventure Comics, but part of it is also Homer and Horace. So Joe Spivey, his channel is not at all saying the guy that brung me to the dance is still my best partner. He's not at all saying that. But hearing that mention, even though it wasn't a wholehearted recommendation, has made me consider maybe a Martin Amis systematic reread. It's not a new idea. I had it before Joe Spivey made a BookTube channel. I had it when Amis died. That maybe this is a thing to do. Years and years ago, I did a systematic reread of his father, probably prompted by his father's death, and got a lot of worth out of it. It didn't. Kingsley Amis is, at best, a B-list author. At best. He wrote one great comic masterpiece, and then a whole career of stuff that isn't. But I found a lot of worth in the stuff, even so, that I didn't see before I embarked on that. And I thought that maybe 2024 would be a time to reread all of Martin Amis. I've heard rumors. I don't know if it's true. I don't see how it could be. Considering how much of his life was lived in the 21st century, I don't see how it could be. But I've heard rumors of a massive brick of a collected correspondence that is in the works, that has been authorized, that is coming. The idea that I heard, I don't know, it could be completely apocryphal. The idea that I heard is that it's meant to be a companion to the gigantic brick of the letters of Kingsley Amis. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but I thought about, what about a systematic reread of Martin Amis's novels now, in 2024? Every critic in the world was writing about these things. A new Martin Amis novel was sure to get the crank machinery going so that you would get a piece by everybody. Same thing with Updike, same thing with Roth. These were people who... there were a whole bunch of major authors currently writing in the late 20th century, the early 21st century, who you wouldn't expect that a new book by theirs would crank the machinery into motion. But Amis was one of the ones where it would. Where if he came out with a new novel, it was going to be reviewed everywhere, just as a matter of course. Surely that has a kind of importance to it. No matter what I might end up thinking about the novels, I gave every novel that he wrote serious critical attention at the time when it appeared. I was not sleeping on him, as the kids say. I was not relegating him to some second tier of consideration. I was seriously analyzing each book, as I do now for every major author currently writing in English. I seriously analyze each book in the perspective of all the previous books of theirs that I have read. So Martin Amis, for me, was the kind of accidental reading project where I'm reading every book by the author anyway. So it's going to be a project. It's going to amount to one. But rereading him would be a project, because I would be going at it intentionally. I would be. It's not much in the way of biographies or letter collections yet, but I would start with his first published book and move on from there. I'd just do them all. I doubt it would take me more than a couple of months. And it might be worthwhile. Who knows what might come of it. That's one idea for 2024, but of course the big idea for 2024 I'm already embarked on, and you'll notice I have not talked about it. I need to do more thinking about that, but Daniel's video made me realize I don't talk about my reading projects. I will mention them, but I won't discuss them. the way I discuss almost everything else on this channel, almost everything. That is Iris Murdoch, and I'm already up to the bell in reading her books. I'm already up to this. This is, I think, the fourth book that she wrote, that she published. One of you was very kind enough to send me a huge stack of all of these old Penguin trade paperbacks and to just shush me when I said it's a flagrant violation of rule number 1 on this channel, which is don't send me a book. The person just shushed me. The nerve. I am doing this, and I'm doing it in paperback rather than in ebook. And that's 2024. That's certainly a kind of reading project. No doubt about it. Before I embarked on the novels, I did John Bailey's books on Iris Murdoch and a collection of letters. And now I am in the novels, and I am getting a lot out of it. This is going to be a very good systematic reread, a very good reading project. But there are less formal ones. Like just the other day, Mark Richardson did a video on his channel and showed all the things that he is currently reading, that he's currently moving the bookmark in 4 or 5 different books, including a couple of different series. If you watch that video, I'll try to remember to leave a link to it down below, but if you watch that video, what you're looking at there is a kind of reading project. They're all reading projects. It's not that you're reading the newest thing. You're working your way through, very consciously, through a whole thing, either a person's body of work or the whole series by one person. And he mentioned Patrick O'Brian. He's up to the Surgeon's Mate. That immediately reminded me of these. These are always worth revisiting. I was planning on doing a front-to-back reread of the Aubrey and Maturin novels by Patrick O'Brian in 2024. I grabbed The Surgeon's Mate because I immediately felt FOMO. I immediately felt, when he mentioned that he was reading The Surgeon's Mate, I immediately wanted to grab it and read it myself. But I started it, and I love it. I love Patrick O'Brian. I love these books. I would not, in this case, this would not be a systematic reread. I have no interest in reading any Patrick O'Brian biographies. I have no interest in reading any of his non-Maturin, Aubrey and Maturin novels. Just not there at all. No interest whatsoever. I'm not in school. I'm not going to read something I'm not interested in reading unless it's for work. So it would just be the Aubrey and Maturin novels. And I grabbed Surgeon's Mate impulsively, but I don't think I'm going to yield to that impulse. I think what I'm going to do, I stopped myself last night from just rereading, from adding it to the night's reading. I think what I'm going to do is a front to back. I'll start with Master and Commander and just work my way through the Aubrey and Maturin novels. But that's not exactly, that is a kind of reading project. And maybe in your own reading world, that would be the only kind of reading project that you do. Maybe you say, I'm going to read all the Amber books by Roger Zelazny. I'm not going to read everything by Roger Zelazny. I'm just going to read the Amber books. Or I'm going to read the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. A very different kind of reading project than saying I'm going to read everything by Stephen King. Maybe that's the only kind of reading project that you do. This wouldn't count as the wholesale look at an author that I'm talking about. Whereas, for instance, Iris Murdoch did, and if I did Martin Amis, it would be a systematic reread. It would be a big thing. And there are a couple of other authors. I keep a roster in the back of my mind of the authors who will become the subjects of what Daniel is referring to as a reading project. I keep a roster of those authors. The one kind of reading project, the sort of as-you-go reading project, is covered anyway because I read the new releases in the 15 or 16 genres of the American book market that interest me. So I don't at the moment need to do a systematic reread of authors who are currently working. Major historians, major nature writers, major novelists. I've read everything. I'm okay. I'm in good standing with them. I've read everything since they started working. So that is a kind of project, but it's not the kind of project that I want to ask you about, which is where you just go at something that is well and truly over and say, I want to read all of that. All those books in that series or all of this author, everything this author wrote. I want to know. Daniel ends his video with questions, and I have the same questions. So this is just a response video to him, just an amplification of what he's saying. I want to know, if you do this, I find it hard to believe there's anybody that doesn't do some version of this. I want to know, if you do this, how ironclad are you? If you start one of these things, do you do it? Or does it fritter away? I'm not necessarily talking about things you do if you have a BookTube channel. I'm talking about in your reading life. If you say to yourself, I'm going to read all of Sherlock Holmes, do you do it? In a concerted amount of time? That's another question I have, is the timing. When you do a reading project in your own reading world, is it concerted? or does it sprawl? I will eventually read all of this. Daniel mentions both kinds in his own video. I'm concertedly doing this, or I'm doing it whenever the propinquity of a used bookstore allows it. When fate puts this in my way, that is a part of an ongoing reading project, but there's no clock on it. When I do a genuine reading project, a systematic reread of an author, I tend to put a clock on it. It tends to be an active part of my reading until it's done. Certainly that never sprawls beyond a year. No matter how much the author's written, it never sprawls beyond a year. And I never know the factors that are going to tip me into one of those things. For instance, Iris Murdoch, it was slow to build, but it tipped into being an actual systematic reread on the spur of the moment. I wasn't planning to do it for 2024. 2024, I was planning to do a systematic reread of the poetry of Philip Larkin, and I am. But that was a long time planned, and I know what comes after him. I know there are a few names in that roster that are coming to the fore, slowly but surely. The Murdoch, though, wasn't planned for 2024, but here it is. Are you like that? Do these plans form suddenly, or when you're looking ahead at a new year? We're still at the beginning of 2024. Lots of horrors in store for the rest of this year. We're still in January. When you look ahead to your reading for the rest of a given year, at the beginning of that year, do you decide then what you're going to do? And how do you decide? I want to know all of it. I want to know all the details. Feel free to tell me in the comments or email me. Make a video if you're one of the rare booktubers who watches my channel. Do you do this sort of thing? I'll find it very hard to believe if you say that you absolutely don't do any kind of a reading project. I've almost never met a reader who didn't do something along these lines. If you do, what kind of a thing do you do? Is it very, very ad hoc? Is it whenever I'm at a used bookstore and I find a book by this author, I get it and I read it because I am wanting in the back of my mind to read everything by them? Or is it more focused than that, more pointed, where it's not that I'm hoping to run across a novel or a work by some author in a used bookstore. It's that I'm going and getting them because I want to read everything. Which is it? Who is it? Why is it? I want to know all. Tell me all. This is just a fascinating subject. So here's hoping for some videos on the subject, but that I could not resist responding, because this is like knitting. And you all know I'm a big knitter. This is like knitting. You are at a thrift store or a barn sale or something like that, and you come across a basket of yarn. And it's pennies each, a nickel each. It's totally cheap, and most of it's junk, but some of it maybe is something, a color or a texture that you haven't really seen before. It's an idle thing. You have no thought about it at all. You pay your 15 cents and you get it. And it goes in your own basket. And you don't even think about it. That's one kind of project. You're putting in the raw material. You have no idea what will come of it. Then there's ideas that you have. You see a pattern. You watch a floss tube channel, or you see something in a magazine, and you think, I could do that. I could, and maybe you even set out a few things that I wonder what my version of that would look like. I could do that. I suppose I could do that. That's another kind. That's another level. Then there is a project that you decide on. All right, I'm going to do this. So I need to lay out everything and know how complex this is, how time-consuming this is, what I'm going to do to it every day, how I'm going to add to it every day. That's another level. And then maybe there's a vast project that you want to do. Maybe you want to make Steve something. I don't know what that would be, because it would be winter clothing. And freakish weather abnormalities notwithstanding, for January of Boston, I'm not going to need winter clothing. Ever. Not in the spring, not in the summer, not in the winter, not ever. In this latitude, I'm not going to need it, so there's no point. But or a tapestry of something, a big, big thing where you do, that is going to need resources and regular, repeated blocks of time. Which kind of knitter are you? Which kind of project is this? I want to know. I want to know all. So tell me all about your reading projects. What level of seriousness do you bring to this? Is it casual? Is it ad hoc when you see a book? Or do you make a project? And if you make a project, do you stick to it and work at it until it's done? Oh, so fascinating. I'll wrap this up for now, but tell me all. Thank you, BookTube.